No, what does that mean? That's not just trade agreements. That doesn't mean that we're just going to be buying and selling from them. When you normalize relations, then you're completely acknowledging the presence and the right of that state, including all of the settlements that they've built, including all of the land that they've annexed that doesn't belong to them, including Jerusalem that they've taken as well, no longer being the capital of Palestine, no longer having the right to Al-Quds. So all of these things are being accepted with that normalization. So it's very important. So you see, and on top of that, there were even indications that they were performing some religious rituals to prepare for the rebuilding of the so-called temple. Okay, this was something that was coming. It was in the works. It was very close. They had done most of the rituals, according to some, except for one of them, which was to slaughter 5 red cows, 5 very particular type of cows that they have to slaughter. And that was supposed to be the last ritual before the rebuilding of the temple. So a lot of people don't realize that this was taking place and how close they were to doing that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by His will, causes these events to take place that bring this issue, this qadiyya, back to the forefront, back to the hearts and the minds of the Muslims who had completely forgotten about it. When we're talking about Al-Quds, we're talking about the first qibla of the Muslims. How long was it the qibla? Can anybody answer? How long was Jerusalem, was Al-Quds the qibla of the Muslims before the qibla changed to the Kaaba, to Mecca? 16 or 17 months in Medina, and we can say that 13 years in Mecca. So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he prayed towards Al-Quds for something like 14 or 15 years, which was longer than the amount of time that he prayed towards Mecca after that. So again, showing you the importance. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he prophesied. He said, after my death, mawti, then he said, thumma fathu Bayt al-Maqdis. After my death, the opening, the conquest of Bayt al-Maqdis, it will be opened up to Islam after my death. And he said the thumma, meaning that it will be one of the first things that happens after my death. Now this happened, the opening of Al-Quds to Islam happened only how many years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ? 6 years. It was only 6 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that Al-Quds and Jerusalem and Palestine was opened up to Islam. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, there's an indication of a prophecy in the hadith when he says, لا يشد الرحال إلا لثلاث, that you shouldn't embark on a journey seeking a particular masjid except for one of the 3 masajid, right? So he's talking about Masjid al-Aqsa as if that land was already opened up to Islam, even though he's saying this before it was. So that's one of the 3 that it's permissible where the reward is multiplied. And some of the scholars, they added a 4th masjid, being which masjid? Because we know the reward is multiplied in Mecca, and we know that it's multiplied in Medina, and we know that it's multiplied in Bayt al-Maqdis and Al-Quds. And there's a 4th one. Which one? That has a specific virtue. Masjid Quba, right? Where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he said that 2 rak'at there, it's like making umrah, right? So some of them said that that's another masjid that has a particular virtue in seeking it out for that reward. Now there's a question that comes up all the time that's asked often. When the reward is multiplied in one of the masajid, does that apply only to the obligatory prayer, or does that apply to every prayer? So for example, we know praying in Mecca is worth 100,000, right? Is that every salah you pray there, or is that only the fariḍah? Is it only the 5 daily prayers? Can anybody answer this question? It depends, mashallah. It's a diplomatic answer. It depends. Depends on what? Applies to every prayer. Is there any proof that we can refer to here? Maybe there's no proof. So the scholars, they differed. Some of them said that it applies to every prayer because of the generality of the Prophet ﷺ saying, as-salah, the salah is multiplied. Therefore, they said the generality of using the word salah means it applies to every salah. Some of them said, no, it only applies to the fariḍah. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Salatul mar'i fi baytihi afdal. He said that the prayer of a person in their home is better, illa al-fariḍah, except for the fariḍah. Now, where is the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ making this statement? He's in Medina, right? And he's still saying what? That the prayer at home is better except for the fariḍah, which would seem to indicate then that the extra prayers, the sunan, are not multiplied. Because if they were, then praying in the masjid would be better than praying at home, right? So it's a mas'ala that's ikhtilafi. So Masjid al-Aqsa, what is the meaning of Aqsa? What is the meaning of the word Aqsa? The furthest. Aqsa, the furthest. Okay? As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asra bi'abdihi laylan min al-masjid al-harami ila al-masjid al-Aqsa, to the furthest masjid. Now, some of the scholars, they said that there's a prophecy in this as well. If that's the furthest of the important masajid, then there's an indication here that what? That there's going to be one closer that also has great importance. This is before Medina. This is in Mecca, right? So that indicates what? There's going to be one that's closer. This is the furthest one. There's going to be one that's closer to Mecca that also has great importance, being Masjid al-Nabawi in Medina. So the Prophet Muhammad is taken there on that miraculous night journey. And who was ruling over Philistine, Al-Quds at the time? During the time of the night journey, which happens about a year or so before the Hijrah, right? Who rules that land at that time? The Romans? The Persians, correct. It's the Persians that were ruling at that time. Of course, the Romans and the Persians were battling, they were in war with each other, and there was multiple battles, and they beat each other. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us in the Quran, غُلِبَتِ الرُّوم, they've been defeated, but they will come back and attain victory again, a miraculous type of victory. So it was the Persians at the time that ruled over Al-Quds. What is the religion of the Persians at the time? They were fire worshippers, Majus, right? So what significance does Al-Quds have to them as fire worshippers? What's the significance to them? Nothing. There's no significance to them. They're not from Ahlul Kitab. There's no significance to it. So what did they do to the holy sites there, including the churches and other? They turned them into dumps. It became the city dump, right? So notice the significance of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He travels there by night. What does he do when he's there? He leads the prayer with all of the Anbiya, ثم he صلى ثم التفت والتفت, and he finds all of the Anbiya behind him, right? So there's a significance here in what? Nobody's worshipping Allah in Al-Quds at the time. It's ruled by fire worshippers at that time. So there's nobody worshipping Allah. There's no temples where people are worshipping Allah, the Creator. That's not happening. So that increases the significance of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ being taken there and praying that prayer with all of the Anbiya behind him at a time when nobody is worshipping Allah in Al-Quds. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us as well as about it that what? Barakna hawlahu, right? Which means what? Everything around it is blessed. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't say this about any other place except for Al-Quds. Barakna hawlahu, that everything around it is blessed. Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, he comments on this and he says that it's blessed spiritually because of the Anbiya that pass through there and the Malaika that worship there and all of those ahadith. As well, it's blessed what? Physically, the land, the rabwa, whatever grows there is blessed as well. It has the fertile soil, whatever grows of the olives and the olive oil and all of that is also blessed as well. So it's blessed physically and it's blessed also spiritually. So it's a few years after the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ dies that it's opened up to Islam during the Khilafah of Umar ibn al-Khattab, right? So we know the story. Umar ibn al-Khattab, the patriarch of Jerusalem, he refuses to give the keys except to Amir al-Mu'mineen because of that reputation of justice, and they know that the places of worship will be left alone and they'll be able to continue worshipping according to their religion. So he refuses and he says, We want that humble one. He's mentioned in our scriptures, the ones with patches in his clothing, that's to come and receive the keys to Jerusalem. So Umar ibn al-Khattab, he takes that journey and he goes and he's handed the keys to the city. Okay. Now, when he enters the city, he didn't like to leave Medina. He used to make a dua. Umar, he had a dua. What was his dua? He had a famous dua that he used to make. Allahumma arzuqni الشهادة في سبيلك والموت في مدينة رسولك. He used to ask Allah, oh Allah, bless me with the shahada in your path and allow me to die. He was very greedy. Not just shahada he wants to die in the city of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So some of the Sahaba, they would say to Umar, how can you make this dua? How are you going to die a shaheed in Medina? Medina is secure and the ummah is strong, and who's going to attack Medina now? It's not going to happen. So what kind of dua are you making that you're going to die a shaheed in Medina? This is too greedy. You're asking for too much. But indeed, Allah answered his dua, right? And he's stabbed in Salat al-Fajr and he dies a shaheed in Medina. So Umar, he didn't like to leave Medina because he's looking forward to his dua being fulfilled by Allah, which is also the fulfillment of the prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ when they were on the mountain of Uhud, and Uhud is shaking. So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ says to it, what? أثبت يا أحد فإن عليك نبي وصديق وشهيدان. He says to the mountain, stop shaking, be calm, because there's a prophet on you, and the Siddiq, and two martyrs, two shuhada. One of them is Umar, of course. So he knew that this was his dua would be fulfilled. He leaves reluctantly to go be handed the keys to Jerusalem. When he enters, he's reunited with some of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that he hasn't seen for a long time. Of them is Bilal radiallahu anhu. That he hasn't seen Bilal since the time of the death of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, because Bilal left Medina upon the death of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. He left immediately. He couldn't even stand to stay in Medina after the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ has passed. So he left, and they're reunited. And Umar, he said, هذا يوم من أيام الله. Ya Bilal, this is of the days of Allah. We're meeting again. We're in Al-Quds, this place that was beloved to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. We're reunited again. So he asks Bilal what? Ya Bilal, what did Bilal used to do? Can you call the adhan for us? Like you used to call the adhan for us in Medina. Will you call the adhan? How amazing would that be? That we hear the adhan of Bilal, like we heard it at the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Since we haven't heard it since then, Ya Bilal. But Bilal, he refuses. He said, لَقَدْ أَخَذْتُ عَلَى نَفْسِي عَهْدًا. I swore to myself I would not call the adhan. Why? Because it was none other than Rasulullah ﷺ that used to tell me to call the adhan. Adhan ya Bilal. Arihna biha ya Bilal. Give us comfort with it, O Bilal. It was the Prophet ﷺ that used to ask Bilal or command Bilal at the time of each salat to call the adhan. So ever since the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ died, Bilal couldn't stand for somebody else to be the one telling him to call the adhan other than Rasulullah ﷺ. So he refused to call the adhan since that time. But Umar keeps going. Ya Bilal, we're in Al-Quds. This is the place of the Isra. This is the place that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ prophesied. This is the holy land, the blessed land. Eventually, Bilal, he agrees and he calls the adhan. So the narrator of this particular hadith, he said, when Bilal started to call the adhan, what happened? ذكر الناس النبي. The people remembered the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When they heard the adhan of Bilal, they immediately remembered Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he said, I've never seen warriors like the likes of Umar ibn Khattab, the likes of Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah fall to the ground crying like I saw them cry on that day when they heard the adhan of Bilal. So look at the significance of this place. The Sahaba, when they entered that place, what they felt and what they remembered when they entered. And this was of the prophecies of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Now it's very interesting. Ibn Kathir, he has a book called Kitab al-Nihaya. And he mentions in it many of the prophecies of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And it will increase your iman to read these prophecies and how they occurred exactly the way the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ told us they would happen. Very, very interesting. For example, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, إِذَا افتتحتم مصر, when you open Egypt, Misr to Islam, فَاسْتَوْصُوا بِالْقِبْطِ خَيْرًا, then treat its people, the Aqbat, very well. So the Prophet ﷺ prophesied what? the opening of Egypt to Islam. And that happens shortly after Al-Quds, a couple years after that. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when they were digging the ditch before the battle of Khandaq, and they reach a stone that nobody can break, so they call the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to come and break the rock, and he strikes it and he says, Allahu Akbar utitu mafatih. Which one first? Asham first, and then Mafatih, Faris, and then Yemen. And they were opened up to Islam. Not only all those places were open, but in that exact order that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ mentions. Now imagine a small group of people that can hardly defend this small city, and the Prophet ﷺ is prophesying that these great empires are going to be opened up. Yemen and Faris and what was ruled by Rome at one point and by the Persians at another. He's prophesying in the exact order that they will be open to Islam. And the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا هَلَكَ كِسْرَى فَلَا كِسْرَى بَعْدَهُ وَإِذَا هَلَكَ الْقَيْصَرُ فَلَا قَيْصَرَ بَعْدَهُ. When the Kisra and the Qaisar, the leader of the Romans and the leader of the Persians, when their empire ends, there will not be another great leader like them in either of those places. And indeed, those empires ended and they greatly downsized, and most of their lands were opened up to Islam after that. Look at these prophecies. These are very, very specific prophecies. And I mentioned the one on the mountain of Uhud. These two will be will die as shuhada. Ibn Kathir, he brings over 50 of these prophecies from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. We're not talking about generalities. We're talking about things that happened very specifically the way the Prophet ﷺ said they would happen. So back briefly to Al-Quds. Now, we see in the ahadith that this place is going to take special significance towards the end of times. So in the hadith that's recorded by Al-Tabari and authenticated by Shaykh Al-Bani, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he said, إِنَّ أَوَّلَ هَذَا الْأَمْرِ نُبُوَّةً وَرَحْمَةً ثُمَّ خِلَافَةً وَرَحْمَةً ثُمَّ مُلْكًا وَرَحْمَةً. He said the beginning of this matter of Islam will be a nubuwah with rahmah, with mercy from Allah, with blessings from Allah. Then there will be a khilafah and rahmah. Then there will be a kingship with rahmah. So those will be the first three phases after the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Then he said, ثُمَّ يَتَكَادَمُونَ عَلَيْهِ تَكَادُمُ الْحُمُرِ فَعَلَيْكُمْ بِالْجِهَادِ. Then after those years of blessings from Allah, what will happen? The people will compete with one another for authority. They will start to fight each other like animals biting at one another for the authority, right? And we see clearly that happens. So the Prophet ﷺ said what? During that time, when you see corrupt rulers and corrupt leadership and people fighting for authority, فَعَلَيْكُمْ بِالْجِهَادِ. At that time, we will go back to a period of a just jihad. Okay? There will be a jihad which is just at that time. And he said very specifically, وَإِنَّ أَفْضَلَ جِهَادَكُمْ الرِّبَاطِ. And the best of your jihad is ribat, which means to develop to create a defensive front and to guard the homeland, to guard the land of the Muslims. The best of your jihad is ribat. وَخَيْرُ وَأَفْضَلُ رِبَاطِكُمْ عَسْقَلَانِ. And the best ribat that will occur is in Asqalan. Where is Asqalan? Now it's a small city, okay? But what historically Asqalan was what? Even Gaza. Gaza is part of Asqalan. Historically, Asqalan goes from the Sinai all the way up through part of Palestine. Historically. Because Imam al-Shafi'i, for example, he was from Gaza, but it's mentioned in the books Asqalan. And he was from Gaza. He was born in Gaza. So Gaza historically is part of Asqalan. So the Prophet ﷺ is saying what? That the best of your ribat will be Asqalan. This is the best of your ribat. And in some narrations, he mentions that there will be 50,000 of the shuhada from there. And they will be the best of the shuhada in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So look at the significance and how that area comes back to the forefront near the end of times. One of the tabi'een, he said, لا تعد الفتن شيء. The fitan, the trials, don't count them as anything until they come from Ash-Sham. So the fitan that are going to occur when you see them coming in the land of Ash-Sham, those will be the real trials. Those will be the trials near the end of times. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ gave us some good news. Yes, there's going to be fitan, there's going to be shuhada, There's going to be people dying. But he also said, إذا رأيت الخلافة قد نزلت الأرض المباركة الأرض المقدسة. When you see the Khilafah return to الأرض المقدسة, to Bayt al-Maqdis, I mean, there's going to be a Khilafah and its capital will be Al-Quds. There's going to be a Khilafah, its capital will be Al-Quds. And he said, when that happens, that means it's the beginning of the great trials, the zalazil. There's going to be great earthquakes and trials and major events. And he said, when you see that occur, الساعة يومئذ أقرب من الناس من يد هذه من رأسك. He said, when that happens, when the Khilafah returns to Al-Quds and the great trials return, then the day of judgment is closer to you than my hand is to your head. And he put his head on the forehead of one of the companions. The day of judgment is closer to you than my hand is on your head. So notice, subhanallah, are we seeing the beginning of these events? It seems that we are. How long? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a'la wa a'lam. We don't know how long it's going to be. But if we look at these ahadith now, and we looked at them just 10 years ago, we might not see them with in the same light, the same perspective that we have now. So, very briefly, before we run out of time, inshallah, what's important for us, of course, is in that same hadith of Hudayfa. Hudayfa, he asked the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it was the hadith we started with. He said, what do I do, Ya Rasulullah, if I live to witness those times? What do you advise me? So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he told him, Ya Hudayfa, تعلم كتاب الله تعلم كتاب الله واتبع ما فيه. Hudayfa, learn the book of Allah and follow what's in it. And he repeated it 3 times. Learn the book of Allah and follow what's in it. Now there's a significance here in that when the trials occur, when a person is going through great trials, severe trials in their life, at that time, is it going to be possible to start learning knowledge, to start memorizing some knowledge, to start going through books and learning academic information? It's not possible during the times of the trials to learn the knowledge, to memorize the Quran, to start implementing it in one's life. If we weren't doing so before that time, it would be very difficult to expect somebody to start doing it during the trials, right? So we have to learn the knowledge and connect ourselves back with the Quran before all of those things happen. During the trials, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he said, Al-ibadatu fil harj, ibadah during the times of the trials, kahijratin ilay, receives the reward of making hijrah to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So a person able to hold on to their faith when the trials become severe receives the reward of making hijrah to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself. And when we look at the words of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when he spoke about the ends of times, he always tells us what? To hasten to do good. For example, the Prophet ﷺ, he said that the sun will rise from the west. He said, يُغْلَقْ حِينَئِذٍ بَابُ التَّوْبَةِ. When you see the sun rise from the west, then what? The time of tawbah is over. The door of making tawbah has closed. So what should I understand from that? That I better make tawbah before that time comes. I better hasten to make tawbah before I live to see that time. Or the Prophet ﷺ said, for example, بَادِرُوا بِالْأَعْمَالِ سِتًّا. Hasten to do good before six things occur. And he mentioned some of the signs of the ends of times. So it's always hasten to make tawbah, hasten to do good before those times comes. And sometimes he was telling us to stay away from things. He said, for example, there will be trials. القاعد فيها أفضل من القائم والقائم أفضل من الماشي. Some trials will come, they will be so severe that a person sitting is better than the one standing, and the one standing is better than the one going towards the trials. I mean, stay away from it. Some of the trials, just stay away from it. Don't confront it. Don't go out to it, right? So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he told us to hasten to do good during these days, during these times, and he told us to stay away from the fitan when they seem to be severe. And inshallah, we'll close with that. So there's a couple of minutes left for questions if there are any, inshallah.
Jazakumullah khairan, Shaykh, for a brief history of Al-Quds and importance of Al-Quds. So we have 5 minutes left. So we can take a couple of questions. So we'll take one question from brother side and one from the sister side. So brother side, any questions?
نعم تفضل. The prophecy is Kitab al-Nihaya Ibn Kathir.